Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Baseball Hall of Fame and our Bullpen Theater. We also want to welcome those of you who are joining us on Facebook Live. This is the kickoff to our 2022 author series, and it's really been a while since we've done a regular author series. The last time was way back in 2019, 3 years ago. Seems like 30 years ago, but we're very glad we're able to bring back the in-museum author series. My name is Bruce Marcus, and I work in the education department. And joining us today, the author of this really fun book, Lights, Camera, Fastball, How the Hollywood Stars Changed Baseball back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Dan Taylor has written 4 books. He has a new book coming out. We'll talk about that a bit later on. He also does television broadcast work for the Fresno Grizzlies franchise as well. Please welcome Dan Taylor to the Bullpen Theater.
And if I could real quick, Bruce, I want to introduce my co-pilot, my wife Eve, who is a key part of all of these projects. Thank you very much.
Yes. And very important to mention, Dan and Eve this week are celebrating their 40th anniversary. Congratulations on that. And you'll be in Cooperstown for a couple of days.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Terrific. We're glad you could join us. You know, with the author series, we're always really pleased when we're able to bring terrific authors and books to the Hall of Fame. Sometimes I'm not able to read an entire book. I maybe read a chapter, a couple of chapters, skim the book, read some reviews. But this was sent to me by some friends of yours who are watching right now on Facebook Live, Mary Jane and Michael Dante. They sent me this book back in 2021, and they said you have to read it. It's a lot of fun, and I did read it, and it is terrific. It's very entertaining. It's very insightful. Let's start with key character, his name, believe it or not, Bob Cobb. Now, we have some Seinfeld fans here, I'm sure, and this is not the Bob Cobb, the maestro from Seinfeld. There was a real person named Bob Cobb. He owned a famous restaurant, the Brown Derby. He became the owner of the Hollywood Stars. Pick up the story from there. If you
November 1938, there was a club in LA, the Hollywood Stars, and after their first season, they were in dire financial straits. Bob Cobb, owner of the Brown Derby, and a guy who's probably touched your life and you don't even know it. But Bob Cobb reached out to a lot of his friends who were some of the biggest movie stars in the business. Bing Crosby, Cecil B. DeMille, Barbara Stanwyck, on and on and on, Gene Autry, put together a group, and they bought this Pacific Coast League club, the Hollywood Stars. And Bob Cobb was an amazing innovator. And how did he touch your life? Bob Cobb's the guy that created the Cobb Salad.
Amazing. And here I thought it was Ty Cobb all these years. Not quite the
Has
case.
a baseball connection, though.
That's right. That's right. Now, the Brown Derby is something that's really important part of the story. It was an important part of Hollywood culture. I first became aware of it watching I Love Lucy reruns in the 70s, because they featured the Brown Derby when they went on their trip to California. And so the Brown Derby was sort of part of the equation there. Talk, if you will, Dan, about the importance of the Brown Derby to the Hollywood culture back at this time.
Well, there were ultimately 4 Brown Derby restaurants around Los Angeles. The first was the one built in the shape of a derby. The original owner of that brought Cobb in as a partner. And then when he died, they had also set up a second Brown Derby at Hollywood and Vine, and Cobb took over that, and the original was set aside for the daughter of the original owner. The Hollywood and Vine Brown Derby, which was depicted in I Love Lucy, was a mecca for celebrities. That was the area where all of the radio studios and the motion picture studios were congregated. So at lunchtime, the actors, the directors, executives, they would all walk over to the Brown Derby for lunch. And Cobb really learned how to I don't want to say appease them, but he would set up phone jacks in all the booths, and they could run a phone to the booth so they could do business while they ate. And he really catered to the foods they liked. He would add some of their favorite foods to the menu, but he became great friends with these many movie stars that would congregate and have lunch and dinner at the Brown Derby, and brought many of them together in his investment group when he bought the Hollywood Stars.
How was he as an owner? We know you did a great job with the restaurant, built that up into this franchise, this empire. But as a baseball owner, how would you rate him?
You know, I think he's a real underappreciated guy in terms of baseball history. And this is what really struck me, because what got me interested in this, I wrote a book about the iconic baseball scout George Genovese, a scout's report, my 70 years in baseball. And George spent 2 seasons playing for the Hollywood Stars. And we would be at games and George would say, well, we started that at Hollywood, or we did that at Hollywood. And I was really taken aback that some really interesting things that we see in the game, every day, came from the Hollywood Stars. And that got me wondering where this came from, who was behind it. And it was Bob Cobb. He was a very innovative guy, certainly knew what would please celebrities, brought that into the ballpark there in Hollywood. But there were a number of things that he did that really were very unique and brought innovation to baseball. And he was way ahead of his time and very underappreciated.
He was the majority owner, but he brought in some big names as minority shareholders. George Burns, Gene Autry, Gary Cooper, Bing Crosby, Barbara Stanwyck. Now we have some younger folks in the audience, may not be as familiar with some of these names, but these were all Hollywood legends.
Oh, huge, very big. And what they did, the initial plan was a share offering. Each share was $7,000. Nobody could purchase more than 1 share. Nobody could take any profit out of it. All profits had to go back into the ball club or the ballpark. And he put his group together in a day and a half. And it was really Cecil B. DeMille was the first to sign on. And he just went through his Rolodex. If you even know what a Rolodex is? I'm dating myself there. Yeah. But he just went through his list and put it together very quickly.
All these people I mentioned, were they all baseball fans, or did they just want the notoriety of being on?
They were fans. And I think that's one of the interesting things that in this project to see was what great fans the biggest movie stars of the day were. I mean, and talking to people who played for the club, talking to people who went to games as fans, one of the things they all said was they were there every night. Bing Crosby and his wife were there every night. And I asked a friend of mine who grew up near the ballpark and was there, he likes to say 100 days of the year, Artie Harris. And Artie said, well, it's no big deal. He said, you always saw Bing there with a pipe and his wife. And Chuck Stevens, who played first base, talked about Jimmy Stewart inviting him into his home for dinner. Gail Patrick, who was an actress in the 30s, and she created the Perry Mason TV series. She was Bob Cobb's first wife. Later, with a future husband, on Mondays, which was the day off in the Pacific Coast League, she would have the players to her home for pool parties and barbecues. So they were the celebrities were very involved with the players. Players really were surprised when they would join the team to find that these huge movie stars that were there every night were as big a fans of them as they were of the movie stars. So it was a unique environment, and they were very active with the club. On bat day, when they passed out souvenir bats, it could be Bing Crosby, Barbara Stanwyck, Gary Cooper. They'd be at the turnstile passing out the bats. Bill Frawley, who was Fred Mertz on I Love Lucy, big fan, and he constructed an MVP wall in the ballpark. They were very, very actively involved beyond just buying tickets and cheering on the team.
So this was a minor league team, but it was very much a major league atmosphere, especially in terms of the crowd. I believe that Groucho Marx went to pretty much every game. That's true?
Irv Noren told me the story. Irv Noren was the 1945 Coast League Most Valuable Player for Hollywood, later played for the Yankees and a few other clubs in the big leagues. And Irv shared a story when he got involved in horse racing after baseball, that he ran into Groucho Marx's son at Santa Anita one day. And the son was excited because the family had always gone to Hollywood Stars games. And the son, Irv said the son told him, I didn't realize that dinner was supposed to be something other than a hot dog, a Coke, and peanuts. Because they were doing that every night. But Groucho was there right next to the bat rack, cheering the players on before their at bats. And it was a very unique atmosphere. And Hollywood was quite different that way.
The ballpark they played in, Gilmore Field, it opened up May 2nd, 1939. Tell us about the ballpark.
It was very unique. Cobb wanted the park built out of wood. And when I mentioned the share offering and the partnership, what they raised a little over $200,000. $40,000 was spent to buy the ball club. $50,000 was set aside for the manager to improve the previous horrible ball club by buying players. And then $100,000 went toward 50% of the cost to build a ballpark. They partnered with a local oil man by the name of Earl Gilmore. And Gilmore was quite an entrepreneur. He put up the other half and oversaw construction. 10,000 seat ballpark. Cobb wanted it built out of wood because the other park in town, Wrigley Field, where the LA Angels played, was all concrete and steel. Mm-hmm. And Cobb felt, as a fan, having been there many times, that it got cold at night, and he was concerned about comfort. But the boxes were not your typical baseball box seats. They were patterned more after Hollywood Bowl or the Hollywood Park Racetrack, where they had a backing and sides and some privacy for the box owners. He put a VIP lounge. We were talking 1939. He put a VIP lounge beneath the stands for the celebrities. That pregame had a band, had a buffet, had an open bar. The things he did in the park were way ahead of the game.
What was the capacity there?
Well, initially 10, and then they added some bleachers down the lines and brought it up to 12,000.
Similar to Doubleday Field,
right
down the street.
Right.
Interesting. And of course, the Hall of Fame opened up about a month after Gilmore Field opened up
right.
in 1939. Now, the team ended up leaving in 57. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Why was the ballpark torn down so quickly after their departure? It wasn't that old.
No, it wasn't. Earl Gilmore was an oil man, and he had also had the largest chain of gas stations in the West. His oil wells began to go dry, so he was transitioning into property development and oil exploration in other states. CBS came in and they wanted to build a massive multimedia complex. So Gilmore's complex had Gilmore Field, his ballpark, the Pan Pacific Auditorium, which was the indoor arena of the day. He had Gilmore Stadium, a 22,000 seat football stadium, which was also popular for auto racing, and a movie theater, an outdoor drive-in movie theater. So CBS came to him and proposed buying land to build their media complex. So he first sold the parcel that the football stadium was on, and the Rams choosing to play in the Coliseum as opposed to his stadium pretty much hastened the stadium's demise. But he gave CBS an option on the land that Gilmore Field was on, and they exercised that option, and that's what brought Gilmore Field down.
Now, the franchise was incredibly successful during this roughly, 20-year period of time. How close did they come to getting a major league team?
Well, when you say successful, their first 10 years, they were awful. They were a second division club through most of that time. They had 1 year where they were in the playoffs, but for the most part, they were a second division club. And then that changed in 49 when they linked up, when Fred Haney became the manager, and they linked up with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And they had an amazing
more
5-year
financial, cultural success.
Yes, they did very well. You're absolutely right. That way, they did very, very well. And your question again, now that I digressed, sorry.
How close did they come to actually getting a Hollywood franchise in the major leagues?
Coming out of World War II, the Pacific Coast League began the first of 3 pushes to gain major league status. And initially, when Happy Chandler was the commissioner, he came out, did some site inspections, but dismissed the idea of the Pacific Coast League becoming the 3rd major league. But when Ford Frick became the commissioner, he took a different approach, and he created criteria for gaining major league status. And Frick said, we're not going to expand by a team or two like you see today. He said, if we're going to expand the major leagues, it's going to be by bringing an entire league in. And so they really studied the Pacific Coast League. And the one area where they fell short was their ballparks. The size of the markets, the attendance, things of that nature. They were pretty close in a lot of those areas, but the ballparks, not a chance. Wrigley Field, where the Angels played, was pretty much a replica of the ballpark in Chicago. That was deemed major league quality. But the rest of them, and so Cobb began working on that. But as clubs started to move, I mean, the Braves were the first to go from Boston to Milwaukee. Then you had the Browns that left and went to Baltimore. But Bill Veeck made a real strong push to move the Browns to Los Angeles. And Cobb was the obstacle. Cobb argued that They were not bringing a good club into Los Angeles. Los Angeles deserved better. And what he was really trying to do was champion the Pacific Coast League. And the mayor of Los Angeles, he didn't think much of the Coast League's chances. When the A's left Philadelphia for Kansas City, there were investors from Los Angeles that went to those meetings and boasted that they were going to bring the A's to Los Angeles. When word got out that they never showed any evidence of having the money and they did not have a stadium plan, the media really blasted the mayor for not having a good plan to bring Major League Baseball to Southern California. Cobb did have a plan. Cobb had gone up into Chavez Ravine one day and looked around and was really impressed with what he saw. And Cobb felt that Chavez Ravine was the ideal place. This was in like 1952.
Yeah.
Cobb felt that Chavez Ravine was the ideal place for a major league ballpark. He knew the future plans with the freeways and said there'd be access with 3 freeways. And he was set that that's where he wanted to make Hollywood's next ballpark. He got a renowned architect together. They put an amazing stadium plan together that featured a lot of things that were bizarre by that day's standards, but are common now. They called them cabanas. We call them suites, 2 restaurants, childcare, a lounge. It was remarkable what he put together. And the city, they were not interested at all. The county had an area of land, and they told Cobb, hey, if you'll come over here. But Cobb was really set on Chavez Ravine. He felt that was the place. And when the Kansas City investors got the A's, that's when the mayor came under a lot of heat in Los Angeles. And a couple of days after all that came about and the LA Times criticized him, he was speaking at a function and he said, I have a plan that's going to bring Major League Baseball to Los Angeles. And he held up a rendering of a ballpark. He had stolen Bob Cobb's plan.
Wow.
And so Cobb really knew that he was licked at that point.
You think if they had gotten a major league franchise, it still would have been called Hollywood?
It's a good question. Who knows?
I think it's a cool name for
I
a
do
team.
too.
Yeah.
Mark Scott, when the Continental League, Branch Rickey proposed a 3rd major league called the Continental League that really led to the expansion of bringing in Houston and the New York Mets. But Mark Scott became involved with the group, and there were some actors involved.
Yeah.
And they were going to call themselves the Los Angeles Stars.
Right.
But it would be interesting to see what would have happened.
Is Hollywood technically considered part of Los Angeles?
Yeah.
It is.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, the city has swallowed up everything.
Yeah, yeah. This was an incredibly innovative franchise, and you've hinted at some of that, but they brought a lot of things that baseball really had never seen. Short pants among them. Talk about that.
Well, you can run down the list of things that we see in the game today that Bob Cobb introduced. The short pants were very unique, and Cobb, that really wasn't his brainstorm. Fred Haney was the manager, and a columnist in the Los Angeles Times had challenged the Stars to do something innovative with regard to their uniform. And he raised the idea that all these movie studios had these incredible costume design specialists, and maybe they should go talk to them and come up with some ideas. Well, Fred Haney came up with the idea to go with short pants. And it wasn't just, short pants got all the attention, but the top was a t-shirt. And I don't know if you've ever seen or worn flannels that were worn back in the day, but they were heavy. And when you worked up a sweat, they were even heavier. And so the day that the uniforms were shown to the players, I talked to the bat boy, Sandy Oster, and I asked him what the reaction was. He said, well, half the team was, okay with it, but half the team was really upset. And I said, well, who were the guys that were upset? And he said, well, the guys that had the really ugly legs. but Fred Haney loved to run. He loved to steal bases, hit and run, squeeze. So the players sliding and, it tore up their legs. And guys like Carlos Bernier, Tommy Saffel were their key base runners, and they complained to Haney a lot about it. And so it went for about 2.5 seasons before they phased it out. But it really was a big thing around the Coast League. It was a huge drawing card. They would go to other cities and fans would come just to see the shorts. And when they went up, it was interesting, when they went up to Seattle, their first road trip to Seattle was early in the season. So it was chilly. And Haney didn't let the players wear the shorts because he said it was too cold. And the fans went nuts because they had come to see the shorts. They had a game in Oakland, and the old Oakland ballpark was on the waterfront in Emeryville. And after the first inning, Chuck Stevens and some of the other players went back in and said, Skip, it's cold. We can't do this. And he let them change. And when they came out, fans were booing and going nuts over it. They really wanted the shorts. But there's so many other things he brought into the game. One of the things you see in every game now, that middle inning pause where the grounds crew comes out to groom the field. Yeah. The Hollywood Stars started that in 1950. They had a pitcher by the name of Jack Salveson. And Jack had been in the big leagues with the Giants. But by 1950, he was near the end of his career. And he was at a point where to get guys out, he had to keep hitters off balance. And to him, his solution was to work fast. And he would tell his catcher that when you throw the ball back to me, get right back down on the crouch because the next pitch is coming. Games when Jack Salveson pitched went very quickly. And Hollywood did not make as much money at the concession stand on the nights that he pitched. And so Cobb was trying to brainstorm with his staff how to compensate for that. And came up with the idea because he knew the theater and other things and said, we've got to come up with a way to work an intermission into a ball game. And that's when they hit on the idea to groom the infield. And it took some work. They went to the league, they went to the rules committee, and they were turned down initially. And then they were given the green light to test it out through the second half of that season. Yeah. And the following season, everybody was doing it, and it's been a staple of baseball ever since.
Yeah. Cheerleaders also used.
They did use cheerleaders, had cheerleaders on the dugout roof. Yeah, you know, they were the first team also the first team in baseball to fly to away games. Baseball generally shied away from putting a team on an airplane. They were fearful of an accident and what could happen to an entire team. Cobb's response was, we've ferried our troops around during the war with little difficulty. I don't see it being a problem. Cobb flew a lot, so he worked a deal out where when they went to Portland or Seattle or San Francisco, Oakland or Sacramento, they would fly the ball club. And they didn't just fly them. They flew charter. Wow. So they were way ahead of the game.
Yeah.
They were the first minor league team to put their games on television. The Dodgers and Giants, Dodgers first, and then a couple of weeks later, the Giants in September of '39 did experimental telecasts in New York City. It was actually March 30th, 1940, opening day of the 1940 season. Hollywood televised their home opener. And there were not many television sets in Southern California at that time, but the response was tremendous to the point where, you know, they did more games. Now the war years, television's growth was stifled, but coming out of the war, it got to the point where Hollywood was doing every single home game on television. And Cobb got a lot of pushback because teams shared in the gate. And so other clubs felt like they were losing potential revenue. And Cobb said, LA is growing so dramatically, and so many of these people that are relocating to Los Angeles or staying here after their war commitment ends have not been exposed to our product. And that's how he viewed television. It was very different from the way most people in baseball, maybe up into the 90s, viewed television. He saw it as a way to advertise his product and to attract people to come to Gilmore Field.
Dan, how much did the Stars integrate the celebrities into first pitches, speeches, presentations? Talk a little bit about that aspect.
They used them in a lot of these things.
Yeah.
They really did. I mean, who's on first? I mean, they would do skits during doubleheaders, between games of doubleheaders. He would have choirs of celebrities come down and sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." Abbott and Costello did their routines on the field. He definitely used the celebrities in a number of different things. A story about a little league team that one of their players won a drawing for a bicycle, and Groucho Marx was to present the player with a bicycle, and then they couldn't find Groucho or the bicycle, and Groucho was out in the concourse riding it around in circles.
Of course.
So, no, the celebrities were very, very much involved in the things that went on there.
Trying to remember some of the photos in the book, but one that's jumping to mind is a picture of Jane Mansfield, right?
Well, that was another thing, a little funny story there too. But many ball clubs in the 50s in particular had beauty pageants and would have a beauty queen for the season. And what kind of separated the Hollywood Stars from other minor league teams was that the contestants were all actresses. And the studios, the motion picture studios, would enter some of the young actresses that they had just signed to contracts as a way of getting them publicity. And in 1955, Jane Mansfield was Miss Hollywood Stars. So doing a lot of public appearances, a lot of things at games. So I was telling this story. I was doing a talk on Zoom about 1.5 years ago to a group in Pasadena in Southern California. And I was just telling that particular story. And a woman, a member of the club, it was a Kiwanis club, and a woman said, "I was once one of those starlets."
Wow.
And everybody, had the same reaction. And I just said, I don't know why I'm trying to tell stories here. I'd much rather hear what you had to say.
Yeah.
And she said, "Oh, George Raft escorted me to this game, to that game. And yeah, I just signed with his studio, and it was amazing."
Yeah. Do you know if Marilyn Monroe ever went to a game?
There's a lot of pictures you probably have seen. If you Google Hollywood stars, and you'll come up with the pictures of Mickey Rooney and Marilyn Monroe in baseball stuff. That was not for a Hollywood Stars game. It was for a celebrity softball or baseball game that was played in the Stars ballpark. So if Marilyn ever went to a game, I don't know.
Yeah.
Players I've talked to talked about the various celebrities that were at games, and I've never heard her name mentioned.
Yeah. You know my secret that I'm a fan of horror. So
Yeah.
did Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi ever go to a game?
Well, one of the stories, I talked to a guy many, many years ago who had played second base for Hollywood. His name was Sonny Piver. Had a little time with the Pittsburgh Pirates, and I asked Sonny about his experiences with Hollywood. He said the crazy thing is my roommate went for breakfast one morning and saw Vincent Price, and he said he ended up following him all around town most of the day, and he was late for batting practice.
Yeah. Price was a huge fan, by the way.
Yes.
And his daughter, whom I've met at conventions, absolutely loves baseball. Wants to come here, hasn't been able to work it out yet. But she is, Victoria's her name, very nice person. She would really like to come to the Hall of Fame. We hope that
I
can
know she
happen.
has a host.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the managers and some of the players. You mentioned Fred Haney earlier. There were a number of managers the Stars had during that time period. His was really the most significant reign.
Yes. Jimmy Dykes was one of the biggest name managers. He had been fired by the White Sox. They brought him in, and he just, it didn't go anywhere, and it was not a good partnership. And when they let him go, they had a number of managers. And Charlie Root, the former Chicago Cubs pitcher, who was the pitcher of the alleged pointed shot by Babe Ruth, he was their manager, and then a player manager during the war years. But after Dykes was let go late in the '48 season, there was a strong push for Fred Haney. Fred Haney had been the radio voice of the Hollywood Stars. He was a very popular high school athlete in Los Angeles, went on and played in the big leagues with the Detroit Tigers. Later became a manager, managed the St. Louis Browns. He was out of baseball, back home, and jumped at the chance to be the radio broadcaster. He was very well liked. He initiated a knothole gang that had several thousand young people in it. He was extremely popular. And there was a real push on the Hollywood Stars board of directors to make him the manager. And Bob Cobb was reluctant. He liked to just give out one-year contracts, let his business manager control the roster, and Haney wanted a multi-year deal and wanted control of the roster. So there was a lot of reluctance, and finally Cobb gave in. And that's when Haney went and did the tie-up with the Brooklyn Dodgers, with Branch Rickey. And ironically, Branch Rickey and Bob Cobb became the best of friends. Whereas Cobb was really hesitant to get involved with him. They became great friends. They were fishing and hunting buddies. When Branch Rickey was forced out by the Pittsburgh Pirates, Cobb brought him in. He became an investor in the Hollywood Stars, and in 1957 was the chairman of their board of directors. But then Haney went to the big leagues as the manager of the Pittsburgh Pirates, and in came Bobby Bragan. And initially, the fans were not happy about it. And Cobb was a little lukewarm because he liked the real personable, highly known type of managers. And nobody knew anything about Bragan. He had been in the Texas League, didn't have a big reputation for being a personable guy. And so the fans were a little lukewarm, and it took a while before they warmed to him.
Yeah.
And he became a wild man. If you go back, I mean, the strip tease, throwing all of his gear when he was a player manager, he would catch. And he did a strip tease one night, and each piece of his equipment went flying out of the dugout toward the umpires. And his daughter Sissy was telling me the story that he came home and his wife got all over him about it. He said, "Hey, when in Rome, do as the Romans. We're in Hollywood." So,
Wow. Some notable players that came through. One of the early ones was a very colorful character named Babe Herman.
the greatest player acquisition, in my opinion, that the Hollywood Stars ever made.
Really?
When Bob Cobb bought the club, it was right at the start of the winter meetings in New Orleans. And the manager read, and I don't know how it's pronounced, Killefer, I don't know how his name was pronounced, but he had left and he had just arrived in New Orleans. Now, he had arrived in New Orleans believing that he still worked for the previous owner and that he had no money to spend because the club was broke. So he hears from Bob Cobb, "I'm the new owner, and you got $50,000 to spend." So he went out and bought first Bill Sissel, a very good second baseman who had great years with the White Sox, was near the end of his career. But then a couple of hours later, he struck a deal with the Giants and bought Babe Herman. And this was huge because Babe Herman was a Southern California guy. He was from Glendale, a suburb right there by Pasadena. And he'd been a great multi-sport star in high school, gone on and was a huge star with the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was near the end of his career. He had been playing in the minors in the Giant organization in 38, had leg problems. But this brought instant credibility to the Hollywood Stars. Not only Cobb, and I think there were three things that happened. There was Cobb and the celebrity ownership group. There was the stadium finally getting built after previous owners claimed they could get it done and never did. And then there was Babe Herman, a legitimate big league star who was coming home to play for the Hollywood Stars. And he did have a couple of big years left in him. He won the Coast League batting title one year. He wanted so badly to manage the team. And I came out of the project thinking, wow, I wonder what if. But he never got that opportunity. One year he was notorious for holding out. It happened in the big leagues constantly. He did it multiple years in Hollywood. And at one point, they actually just made him an investor in the team.
Really?
As a way of working it through. But it was a huge, I believe, one of the biggest of all the signs for Hollywood.
Who were some of the other big name players that they
Well,
had?
the guy that's here is Bill Mazeroski, one of the great second basemen of all time. And Bill had two stints with Hollywood, but after the middle of the second one, he was called up to the Pirates and had an amazing big league career. Gus Zernial was a left fielder for them that had a tremendous big league career. Irv Noren played a number of years in the big leagues after having won the 49 MVP award. Dale Long, who was a Pirate product coming up. So they had, and there were a number of guys that obviously played in the big leagues, but those were some of the ones that went on and did really well in the big leagues. The most popular Hollywood star of all, well, there were two, but Frankie Kelleher was a power hitting outfielder that they were able to purchase during the war from Cincinnati. And Frankie Kelleher, just a hugely popular home run power hitter. And then Carlos Bernier was a very athletic, very speedy outfielder, base stealer that Hollywood fans called our Willie Mays.
Was Kelleher the player that died very young? Wasn't there a player who became ill and
They had a player who if we're thinking of the same guy, Herb Gorman had been their left fielder.
Herb Gorman?
And Herb Gorman was sold to San Diego in 1950. And it was actually on Easter Sunday. In a game on Easter Sunday, Herb Gorman, in the game against Hollywood, suffered a fatal heart attack in left field.
Wow. When you look back at the quality of play, you mentioned that the Stars, their first 10 years or so, were not that good a team, but then they got a lot better. The Pacific Coast League at the time, some have called it almost a third major league, better than the other AAA leagues of the time. They were in that open category for a while. How good do you think the PCL was during the time of the Stars' reign?
Oh, I think it was very good. Was it big league? No. Was it close? Yes. And I think the important thing to remember was that St. Louis was the westernmost major league club at that time. Fans on the West Coast didn't have Major League Baseball. So the Pacific Coast League, to people on the West Coast, that was their major league. And every player was either on the cusp of going to the big leagues or had just been in the big leagues. So your clubs were filled with big leaguers. Now, some people, in their last couple of years have shared stories that as kids, their dads told them, listen, when the Dodgers start playing, you're going to see the difference. And they did. But I think those 20 years, that 38 through 57, that was the heyday of the Coast League. It was greater than any of the other AAA leagues. In fact, as part of their quest to gain major league status, they ultimately were gained open status. So they were between AAA and the major leagues. They were an open classification in the 50s. But the talent was tremendous. And they were, one of the things Hollywood was doing, which was a little different, they wanted to get into their own player development. I mean, the current single A league out there, the California League, that was created by the Hollywood Stars. They wanted their own minor league for the Pacific Coast League and tried to really encourage other Pacific Coast League clubs to do what they were doing and get into their own player development. And so in 1940, the 6 California-based Pacific Coast League clubs met and agreed and brought together friends and business acquaintances to own these clubs and created the California League. When that, after the war, ended up being snapped up by major league teams that forced the Coast League clubs out, well, Hollywood, Bob Cobb went back to the town where he grew up, Billings, Montana, and created the Billings Mustangs, which have been around ever since as an expansion team of the Pioneer League. So, and Cobb always felt that if we can just get into player development, develop our own young talent, that we will one day be at a point where we will be a competitive major league ball club. That was his goal.
Yeah. One final area I wanted to touch upon, it's a very important part of the story. You mentioned the broadcast aspect, the fact that the Stars were innovative as far as getting their games on television. Their voice was a terrific announcer who died tragically very young, by the name of Mark Scott. Some of our folks here and on Facebook Live may be more familiar with Mark as the host of Home Run Derby for one season. Mark tragically died at a young age from a heart attack. Mark was the father of Mary Jane Dante, who helped get us together, a mutual friend of ours. Mary Jane is a retired film editor, and she is married to an actor, Michael Dante, great people. Michael used to play minor league ball under the name, I believe, of Ralph Vitti. I hope, Michael, I got that name right. But Michael has been in Hollywood for years, very long career. He's written books. He's in his 80s now, but still very active.
Prepared for spring training with the Hollywood Stars.
Did he really?
Gilmore Field, absolutely.
No, he didn't tell me that.
And worked out a little bit there with Nat King Cole, and a few celebrities would come out too.
Interesting. Talk about Mark Scott and his role in promoting the team, because he really did bring kind of a major league professionalism to the broadcast crew.
And if I can expand on that a little bit, I think what was really interesting is the broadcasters in the Pacific Coast League were really, really good. And I think one of the sad parts was that as major league clubs came into California, they wanted to distance themselves from being associated with the minor league team in their area. For example, the Padres in San Diego had a tremendous radio broadcaster whose name escapes me, and I apologize, but he was very popular. He was a former FBI agent, but he was very popular with the fans. And when the Major League Padres cropped up, they said, no, he was a minor league guy. When the Dodgers came west, the radio station pushed Mark Scott. They wanted the Dodgers to make Mark Scott their play-by-play guy. He was outstanding. But the Dodgers said, well, we've got Vin Scully and we're bringing Jerry Doggett in as well. So Mark did some pre and post game work. But Mark Scott was outstanding calling the Hollywood games. He really was. One of the great things, they had this incredible rivalry with the LA Angels that would often lead to huge brawls whenever they played. And it actually kind of got up into the booth too, because there was a brawl one year where Mark Scott on the air was really giving it to the LA Angels manager, and it became a big story in the papers in Los Angeles. But Mark was terrific, and then you had Bud Foster in Oakland, you had Don Klein in San Francisco. These were some immensely talented broadcasters who brought a major league feel to Pacific Coast League baseball, and Mark Scott was among the very best of them.
I still like his version of Home Run Derby better than anything they've come up with.
Right.
He had a desk on the field where he announced from. It was great. We have a few minutes remaining with Dan Taylor before we head out for the book signing in the atrium. Does anybody in the audience here have questions for Dan? Yes.
Could you describe the relationship with the big league clubs over the course of the Stars'
Well, initially,
Yeah.
at that time, the affiliation between major and minor leagues was very, very different than what we see now. What you see now is a major league club furnishes all the players, furnishes the manager and coaches, and the new setup, it's a 10-year relationship. Back then, you would go to a big league club, you might even be affiliated with a couple of clubs, and at most you get maybe 4 players, and then the big league club would actually, for giving you those players, they would demand the first option on signing any of your players that they may want. So every club was independent. They had to go out and they had their own scouts and go find their own players. Hollywood was very aggressive this way. They actually found a loophole in the rule, and they would go out and sign high school juniors because they found the rule only pertained to major league clubs doing that. But yeah, and then when the difference in the Coast League though was that the LA Angels were owned by William Wrigley, and then when he died, his son PK. So they were a Cubs farm team. Almost all their players came from the Cubs. And then as they were trying to gain major league status, there was a meeting in which all the owners felt they had agreed that everybody was going to distance themselves from major league affiliations. And then Cobb announced Branch Rickey as an investor, and it didn't go over too well. But when the Pirates became affiliated, the first year in '49 with Brooklyn, they got, I think, 8 players from the Dodgers. And Haney was very specific. He said, I don't want you sending me broken down old guys like everybody else was getting. He said, I want young guys with upside.
Yeah.
And Rickey was really good about that. So later, though, with Pittsburgh, the majority of the Hollywood players were Pirate prospects, and it forced some of the popular guys out. It forced Frankie Kelleher into retirement. Chuck Stevens, who was a very popular first baseman, was traded away. And it really became more of a traditional farm club in the sense of what we see today.
Any other questions for Dan? Yes, sir.
Did the franchise continue to be well capitalized and make money?
It did. They had some rough years as television became more popular toward the latter half of the 50s. Their attendance dropped. During the war years, everybody struggled, of course. But yeah, their attendance was good, about 8,000 a night on average. They were very profitable. And up until the last 3-4 years when attendance dropped, they did very well.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I know Chuck Connors, AKA the Rifleman.
Yep.
Played the Pacific Coast League. Were there other crossovers with acting and baseball?
Chuck Connors, actually, yes. Chuck had been a Dodger, was traded to the Cubs, and the Cubs sent him to Hollywood. In fact, George Genovese was a good friend of Chuck's from high school in New York, and so they played together. And in '51, and George always told me the story about him drawing a walk and getting to first base in a game with the Angels, and Chuck coming over and going, George, I'm getting into pictures. I got me an agent. I'm getting into pictures. And it was that association that got him in. Bill Frawley, Fred Mertz, was instrumental in getting a lot of the Hollywood players into movies. And you look at a lot of the baseball films, and the extras are Hollywood Stars players and some LA Angels players. So yeah, they got bit parts here and there. And later in the 50s, as television grew, they got on game shows. And so yeah, they had an involvement in
Didn't Joe DiMaggio and his brother start out in the Pacific
They did.
Coast?
They did.
The Seals?
Right, with the San Francisco Seals. Yeah. And Frankie Lazzari. The Yankees bought a lot of players out of the Coast League.
Dan, you brought with you a DVD, and we're going to play a clip from that. If I could have Justin come down and set that up for us. But set the scene. What exactly is in the DVD? What will we be seeing here?
Well, Mary Jane Dandy very graciously demanded that I share this with all of you from her. This is a DVD from 1955, and her father is the narrator. And many of you may know that Christy Walsh was Babe Ruth's agent/manager. Well, his son Christy Jr. was involved in the motion picture industry and produced this for the Hollywood Stars. And basically what it is, it's a season ticket and sponsorship promotional film that they made to take around to service clubs and other community events and showcase the Hollywood Stars. Sonny, am I in your way? Is he okay?
To better acquaint you with your ball club, the Hollywood Stars proudly present this film for your enjoyment and enlightenment. Baseball is our great national pastime, a truly American institution, which has been the leader in creating high standards of good sportsmanship and a better understanding among men. The Hollywood Stars, as we know them, had their inception in 1909 as the Vernon Ball Club, becoming Venice for the 1913 and 1914 seasons. Once again, they were called Vernon, this time through 1925. Following year,
A
the
buck and a
franchise
quarter.
moved to San Francisco.
Those were the
where it
days.
operated as the Mission through 1937.
Could you turn it
In
up?
1938, the team shifted to Hollywood. In 1939, they moved into their present home, Gilmore Field. 10 lean years followed, with only the 1946 club finishing in the first division. Then came Fred Haney and Bobby Bregan, who created golden years by leading the Stars to 3
Yeah.
minutes, 2 seconds. from
Unfortunately,
third.
that's as loud as it
The
goes.
best record for the past 7 years in the Pacific Coast League. Come on inside and meet some of the people who make up the Hollywood Stars family. They're dedicated to making your visits to friendly Gilmore Field more enjoyable. This is Fred Hall, who's in charge of the staff of Mel Morris and ushers. Sammy Gadaro on the left and Ray Orthy on the right are a pair of veterans whom you've seen in Gilmore Field since the day the park opened. Man, oh man, there's nothing like a good hot dog and a cold drink to help you enjoy the ball game. Here's Danny Goodman, manager of the concession department.
He ended up going with a lot of their staff went to the Dodgers when the Dodgers opened up, and he was one.
Like Alfred Hitchcock, I'm in the picture too. Dick Shadd is on my right. In 1956, KFWB will exclusively broadcast all Hollywood games. The Stars are one of the first teams in baseball to televise their games. Hollywood games will not be telecast in 1956. The dulcet tones of Lyle Bond's voice are familiar to all Southlanders. Lyle is an avid PCL booster. Fred Hessler called the play-by-play in 1955 and was always welcome into the living rooms of the fans who were unable to attend the games in person. Edna Ward joined the team in 1939. She's a combination secretary.
Mr. O'Malley's secretary.
Take her reservation
Oh, really?
general of all she surveys. For assistance in any problem, call Edna. Irv Case is in charge of publicity and public relations. He services members of the press with information about the players and the club, make your reading, seeing, and listening about the Twinks more enjoyable.
He became Yankee PR director.
He did,
later.
and AFL and football.
Remember this fellow? He's Paul Jeske, the business manager of the Twinks. He started his career as a bat boy many years ago. Today is in charge of the actual operation of the park and the team's
Twinks was a popular nickname.
The vice president of the club.
Twinklers, and then the media shortened it to call them the Twinks.
Most successful. Robert H. Cobb is the principal owner and president of the Hollywood Stars. He's constantly seeking to improve the quality of both the team and the service for your next visit to watch the Stars play ball. Baseball is a serious business. It's fun to play and fun to watch, but it requires perfect physical condition, proper mental attitude on the part of the manager, coach, and players to provide you with baseball at its very best. Some 3 hours prior to the start of the game is when the physical conditioning begins. Skipper Bobby Bregan
Bregan's
was
in
one of the most
boxes.
controversial and colorful of all players and managers in the 52-year-old history of the Pacific Coast League. Quiet and unassuming off the field, Bregan was a human dynamo once he donned his baseball flannels. Bobby leaned heavily on his able aide, Gordy Maltzberger, who will be back for his 4th year as a coach under the new skipper, Clay Hopper.
Justin, we'll stop it at that point, just to give you a little bit of flavor of the Stars franchise. Bob Cobb, that was obviously in his later years.
Exactly.
He was quite a bit older than when he had first purchased the franchise. As we get set to wrap up our program here in the theater, you have another book that's coming out very soon. You are prolific in this area. You're becoming prolific. It's about a player, multi-sport athlete named Kenny Washington.
Right.
Tell us about that.
The book is called Walking Alone, The Untold Journey of a Football Pioneer. It'll be out July 13th. Great folks that I'm grateful to at Roman and Littlefield. And it's a biography of Kenny Washington, who was the first African-American player in the modern era of the NFL in 1946, reintegrated the NFL, but was really an even better baseball player. And in 3 different instances, was a key figure in attempts to integrate baseball. And when Jackie Robinson signed in October of 1945, he and Wendell Smith, Pittsburgh Courier, both urged Branch Rickey to also sign Kenny Washington. And at the time when the Dodgers finally contacted Kenny Washington, 10 days earlier, he had given the Rams his commitment that he would sign with the Rams and integrate the NFL. And as he said, for many years up to his passing in 1971, that he wasn't going to go back on his word as much as he really wanted to play baseball. He did get a shot after he retired from football. He went into spring training with the Giants in 1950 and was the last player cut. Spent a season in a month, I should say, in the Coast League before calling it quits as an athlete. So it was really a very remarkable research project, and one I'm really honored a story I'm honored to tell.
And that book will be out later this year?
July 13th.
July 13th, not that far away. Of course, most of our focus today on this terrific book, a lot of fun. I've read it cover to cover, lights, camera, fastball, how the Hollywood stars changed baseball. What we're going to do now is head out into the atrium for a book signing. The book is available for purchase in our bookstore. And for those of you that are watching on Facebook Live, you can go to our website, go to baseballhall.org, and there's a link to the museum shop. You can purchase the book there as well. Dan, thank you. This has been great.
Bruce, thank
A lot
you.
of fun.
Thank you all very much.
Folks, thanks for coming out. If you can, join us in the atrium. Thank you.